first light on the 6th of June 1944. An armada of more than 5,000 Allied warships and landing craft, protected by barrage balloons, closed on the Normandy coast. Among the thousands of Allied troops crossing the Channel that morning was a Hollywood director called George Stevens. Stevens was aboard HMS Belfast, in charge of the newsreel team recording the event for the American Army. But at the same time as he supervised the official coverage, Stevens was also taking these unique pictures for himself, in colour. Stevens had brought out from California a private stock of the revolutionary new 16mm Kodachrome. The result, images of remarkable colour and clarity. By 5:30, the German coastal defences were within range of the guns. The assault on occupied Europe was about to begin. A few hours after the main assault force, Stevens himself went ashore. He landed at the village of Bernier-sur-Mer, in the centre of the beach, codenamed Juno. By breakfast time, the people of Normandy were waking to an historic announcement from the Allies' Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
A British tank crew successfully across a German minefield poses for the camera. Stevens commanded the Special Coverage Unit, an elite team of about 30 cameramen and directors. Attached to the Allied Supreme Headquarters, they could move about the battlefield as they wished. It was this superb access which enabled Stevens to shoot what must rank as one of the most evocative home movies in history.
And now, Captain Glenn Miller. Thank you, Lieutenant Don Briggs, and good evening, everybody. It's been a big week for our side. Over on the beaches of Normandy, our boys have fired the opening guns of the long-awaited drive to liberate the world. Now, to get to a little music, here are the boys with their rocket gun version of Flying Home.
The Special Coverage Unit called themselves the Hollywood Irregulars. George Stevens had the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and a reputation as a successful director. Before the war, he made Gunga Din. After it, he made such famous pictures as Shane and Giant. The unit's camp was near the town of Carentan, midway between the two American beaches, Utah and Omaha, which were pumping men and material into the beachhead.
The overwhelming impression was of this extraordinary logistical power coming at thousands and thousands and thousands of ships and hundreds and thousands of tons of material being landed 24 hours a day, pouring inland through every lane, across every road in that beachhead. And it was a sight that you would never dreamt of ever seeing. I mean, if there is victory, which of course we assume there would be, this is what victory is going to be made of. These were truly the sinews of war. And one almost felt illogically that such things as regimental traditions, individual gallantry, elite brigades of soldiers, all that was hardly to be reckoned with against the scales of this amazing accumulation of stuff.
Privately, the generals were worried about the state of the Normandy campaign, but publicly Montgomery radiated confidence.
The pace has been hot, and it was clear that someone would have to give ground sooner or later. It was equally clear that the Allied soldiers would see the thing through to the end and would never give up. And so the Germans have been forced to give ground, which is very right and proper. And today, the Allied armies fighting in Normandy have good grounds for solid satisfaction. And so, to every Allied soldier in Normandy, I say, well done. Well done indeed.
In reality, as Montgomery was well aware, Normandy had become a battle of attrition. In the first 12 weeks of the campaign, over 50,000 Allied troops were killed, 150,000 were wounded. The Allies tried to break out using their overwhelming air superiority to pulverize the German positions. Day after day, the ancient towns and villages of Normandy were turned into landscapes of rubble. On the 25th of July, in one of the biggest raids of all, 2,500 Allied bombers flew over the film unit's camp. Their objective, to destroy the German positions west of the town of Saint-Lô.
Wave after wave of bombers came in, and they were dropping their bombs on one particular little place, Saint-Lô, and the concussion was just terrible. And this push went on for hours and hours, plane after plane.
The skies were full of bombers coming over everywhere you looked and dropping rows of bombs just ahead of where we were to clear out that area of Germans.
Saint-Lô had been a peaceful and picturesque market town, famous for its medieval churches. Then came its liberation. 12 shattering Allied air raids destroyed the German garrison, but not before they'd flattened the town. "800 of Saint-Lô's civilians were killed in a single Allied raid. Saint-Lô's fate was typical of the havoc wrought across Normandy by the British and the Americans as they struggled to escape their bridgehead. At last, in the final week of July, the German resistance began to break. Thousands of prisoners surrendered to be herded into makeshift camps. After 2 months of constant bombardment, the Germans' fighting spirit had collapsed in the face of the overwhelming Allied firepower. Stevens and his unit moved on to join the American armour, now racing east towards Paris.
Alouette, gentille alouette, Alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai la tête. Je te plumerai la tête. Et la tête. Et la tête. Et le bec. Et le bec. Et la bouche. Et la bouche. Alouette. Alouette. Oh, alouette, jolie alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Alouette. 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 Alouette.
Stevens and his men crossed the River Seine using the Army's hastily built pontoon bridge. They were now only 30 miles from the French capital. On August the 23rd, Eisenhower had agreed to give the Free French Army the honour of liberating Paris. Units of the French 2nd Armoured Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, began moving into the outskirts of the city. When the plan was explained, Stevens saw an opportunity to record the crowning moment of the liberation. In a field near Fontainebleau, he approached a Free French colonel and received permission to join them on their drive into the city.
The atmosphere was sort of halfway between a carnival and a bullfight. All the purpose of a war seemed to be coming true before your eyes. It was a rare moment for soldiers to experience, you know.
The streets were lined with happy, happy people. Women, children, men, all out tight in the streets, just enough room to allow our jeeps and vehicles to drive through. And they were waving, they were kissing us. The women and the girls were jumping on board the jeeps and tanks and trucks to kiss the boys. And the ride into Paris through a gauntlet like that was just a very exciting thing to think that we were part of freeing the French people from this occupation by the Germans.
Stevens had barely set up his cameras when Leclerc arrived at his headquarters with the commander of the German garrison. General Dietrich von Choltitz, to Hitler's fury, had agreed to surrender Paris rather than see it destroyed by fighting. Outside, a crowd began to gather. Von Choltitz said later he didn't expect to get out alive. When the two men emerged, Leclerc called the cameras over to record the scene. The Germans' prompt capitulation had saved the city.
BBC Home Service. Here is the news, read by Richard Wesson. Paris has been liberated. A communique just received from General Koenig announces that it has been liberated by French forces of the interior.
At 4:30, de Gaulle himself, leader of the Free French, arrived to confer with Leclerc. De Gaulle was the dignity of France made flesh. The Germans, at his insistence, had surrendered not to the Allies, but to the French government. "We are living," said de Gaulle that afternoon, "through minutes which transcend our poor individual lives."
It was intoxicating, and one said at the time that no matter what would happen afterwards, nothing would ever exceed the emotional experience of the 25th of August, 1944, and nothing did.
Unless you've lived through it, just like the invasion, unless you've lived through it or been there, you can't imagine how the Allies were greeted. And the French populace went crazy and mad, absolutely wild, and climbing on and kissing you and carrying on, giving you a drink and come on over to the house and all this business. And he used to say, no, get off the Jeep, I have work to do. There were girls, and more girls, and more girls. I mean, they were all over the place, and how can I explain it to you? Let's put it honestly, you had to beat them off.
4 days later, the Americans turned a Bailey Bridge upside down and made an improvised reviewing stand. And General Omar Bradley invited de Gaulle to take the salute at a victory parade. The moment the American 28th Division had passed down the Champs-Élysées, it accelerated and drove out of the city to rejoin the Allied offensive. It had taken less than 12 weeks since D-Day to reach Paris. That winter, the German resistance did not collapse. It stiffened. The midwinter days were short and dark, the weather freezing. Such miserable fighting conditions seemed more like the First than the Second World War. One of Stevens' cameramen was actually ordered to make a film about the dangers of trench foot, to which thousands of men succumbed.
An army in winter is not very happy, especially at the front where they're fighting. It's just miserable, trying to keep warm, trying to meet the enemy, obeying orders, and Christmas away from home. It was demoralizing in that sense. An American heavy mortar detachment clearing out the countryside for the infantry to move forward. In the spring of 1945, after the frustrations of the winter, the Allies were once more advancing into Germany. On the 24th of March, the British and Americans mounted Operation Varsity. 22,000 parachutists and glidermen supported the land forces crossing the Rhine in the largest one-day airborne operation of the war.
Once across the great natural barrier of the Rhine, Stevens and his unit followed the American First Army as it advanced into Germany. In 2.5 weeks they penetrated 150 miles until, on the 11th of April, they reached one of Germany's greatest and most secret installations, Nordhausen. Driven into the mountainside at Nordhausen, the Allies found 40 miles of passages and tunnels housing the largest underground factory in the world. This was Nordhausen's product, the V-1 flying bomb. Each flying bomb was capable of delivering a ton of high explosive a distance of 200 miles. Nordhausen's factory line assembly was such that each cost only £125, less than a Volkswagen car. These sophisticated liquid fuel rocket engines belonged to the V-2. Nordhausen turned out V-2 rocket bombs at the rate of 700 a month. Another section of the factory was set aside for the manufacture of jet engines. The Messerschmitt 262 was the first operational jet interceptor in the world. But the brilliance of German science coexisted at Nordhausen with the brutality of the Nazi state. The factory had 13,000 slave labourers, Czechs, Poles, Russians, Frenchmen, Belgians and Italians. The Allies brought men up from below ground to lie in the sun. Some of them hadn't seen daylight for a year.
Ken and I walked through one of the barracks. There was a man lying in a bed with another 2 men in a bunk. And we said we were Americans, and this one man was very happy with a weak, sick face. And we interviewed some of the people there, and when we came back, that man had rolled over and died. We saw some ambulatory prisoners who had bandages on them and were slowly walking around. There were many men there left to die.
In all, 20,000 of Nordhausen's slaves were killed. Some died in the factory, but most were worked until they dropped and then shipped to extermination camps for disposal. Ivan Moffat spoke to one prisoner, a Belgian civil servant, just before he died.
I asked him what he thought of the Germans. And he said, "Monsieur, you could take a dozen German children and bring them before me, lying here, before my eyes, and you could shoot them, and I wouldn't blink an eyelid."
German resistance in the West was now virtually over. A week after the liberation of Nordhausen, the German Army Group B was encircled in the Ruhr. The Allies had expected to take about 150,000 men prisoner. Instead, by April the 18th, they'd captured 320,000, including 25 generals and an admiral. This was an even larger German force than the Russians had captured at Stalingrad.
It was extraordinary to see them all suddenly. They were in these fields, usually below the road, and masses and masses, some of them admirals, generals, even field marshals, privates, everybody all corralled there together. And quite a cooperative in a way. I mean, they wanted to get on with it. They wanted to get on with what was next. It was an odd feeling that of all this enormous power, having laid down its arms and standing there before us, a very strange sensation, not of victory or anything like that, but just a feeling of this formidable machine was there just like a whole mass of sheep in the field, and they're defenseless and unarmed, ready to do our bidding. It was I suppose all armies must feel that in the face of mass of prisoners, but it was very heightened by the sense, of course, that the Germans were probably a more professional and better trained army, really, than we were. And there they all were sort of before us.
Most of the German prisoners were happy to be in Allied hands. They had, at least, escaped the Russians. The Allied advance had reached the River Elbe on April the 15th and halted. It had been agreed that the area east of the river would be the responsibility of the Russians. In the next 9 days, they advanced over 100 miles, until they too reached the Elbe. The two armies came face to face at a town called Torgau. The first contacts between the Americans and Russians began at about lunchtime on the 25th of April. Despite the differences in language and culture, there was an unmistakable emotional affinity. Here were ordinary soldiers, thousands of miles from home, within sight of victory over a common enemy.
But the first Russian I saw was a rather hoary soldier, and it sounds very corny and improbable, but actually what he came up, he grinned and he opened his arms, he embraced me and he said, "Capitaliste, communiste." I mean, that sounds awfully unlikely, but I mean, that's exactly what happened.
This felt like this is what we'd been working for all this way. The link up with the Russians, signifying the end of the German army.
They used many more women on frontline duty or right behind the front lines than we did. They were quite tough looking, but I guess you get tough looking when you get shot at long enough.
Bradley's 12th Army Group made contact with Soviet elements of Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Army Group near the German town of Torgau on the Elbe.
This is the news for which the whole Allied world has been waiting. Nazi Germany, tottering to her final collapse, has been split clean in half. The forces of liberation
As Nazi Germany split apart that April, refugees and POWs spilled onto the roads until it seemed that the entire continent was on the move.
The whole of Europe was like some enormous crossroads, dusty crossroads, dust from all the vehicles churning up the roads. And in the green of the spring there was this dust and this constant stream of all the men of Europe going home, mostly on foot, pushing perambulators and carts. Norwegians going north, Italians going south, Belgians and French going west, people going back to Russia and Poland. Everywhere, people passing each other on these endless crossroads of Europe.
The war in Europe was within a week of its end when George Stevens and his team received orders to move on themselves.